on my behalf. Protect me and my friends and my school from any harm and danger. Holy Mighty, please work through me to be a true friend to others, especially to those who most need a friend. Give me courage to stand up for those who may be bullied or shamed. Help me shine the light of your love to everyone that I meet. Remind me when I feel alone that you're always with me and that my family and parish loves and supports me. Holy Immortal, please also educate my heart to know you better and to walk in my Orthodox Christian faith, even when this sets me apart. Help me remember that you work alongside me in all of my efforts which please you. Thank you for the joy of being your child, and help me to share that joy with others. Amen.
Rain in the Desert. Father Apostolos Hill is Dean of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. On the web at ancientfaith.com.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, hello, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today's date is August 3rd, 2020. And you heard the announcement at the beginning that if you wish to call in with a comment or a question, you can do so by calling us at 855-237-2346. 855 AF Radio, or you could submit a question by emailing us at ask@ancientfaith.com. 3 letters, ASK, ask@ancientfaith.com, or posing a question in the chat room. If you do it early enough in the program, I get those questions and I try to respond to them. All right, so we're going to talk about St. Peter today and the first epistle of Peter. I don't think we're going to get to 2 Peter, but before we do, I just want to apologize for the fact that we didn't have a program last week, because I know that some of you tune in and you're waiting for it to come on and it didn't come on, and then you're kind of wondering what's going on. Well, sometimes things happen, and I just want you to know. And then the other thing that happens, which I didn't even think about, is not only are some of you waiting live, but then later, some of you are waiting for it to post, the lesson to post, so you can listen to it later. I think more of you are listening to it later, and you kind of were wondering what's going on. Well, sometimes things happen, and I just want you to know that we never just blow you off. I want you to know that everybody here at Ancient Faith Radio is very committed to this ministry. We're really committed to bringing you quality podcasts. And if we don't go live when we're supposed to, or don't post something on time, it's okay to email us and ask us, is everything okay? What's going on? If we can answer, sometimes I don't even know what's going on. But we try, okay? And so we'll ask your forgiveness for not coming live last week when we were supposed to, but also also we just want you to know that we really appreciate your support of this station, of this ministry, and just want you to know that we really respect your time, and we're never just we're just never saying, oh, that's okay, we just won't go on tonight. We never do that. We try everything we can to make it happen. All right. So at any rate, we're going to talk about the 2 epistles attributed to St. Peter, and we're going to talk about the epistle itself, and then I'm really going to talk mostly about Peter himself. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because we don't really have much of an opportunity to do that except in the context of his epistles, and his epistles are part of this collection that we call the Catholic epistles or the general epistles. And they're called that because they're addressed to all Christians, not like St. Paul's epistles, which are addressed to a specific community or a specific person, and they're dealing with very specific problems, issues, or concerns that those people were having. So St. Paul's letters are much more difficult to understand because you kind of don't know the backstory. It's like watching a movie and you come in halfway, or you're listening to a phone call and you only hear half of the conversation. You're trying to figure out what the rest of it is. That's St. Paul's epistles because they are very situationally based. But the general epistles, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude, are addressed to all Christians. And that means that they're very inspirational, they're very general, and they have a lot of the same kinds of advice. And that means they're easy to understand. So I don't worry about you having trouble understanding 1st Peter. All right, so that's why I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to talk to you about the person of Peter himself. Also in this epistle, because we're going to talk about one particularly unique passage, and which I think you're going to really like. A lot of this, a lot of the teachings in 1 Peter are very similar to what we'd see in Paul. It's about husbands and wives, masters and slaves, about being humble, about caring for the poor, being respectful of civil authorities, very similar. Since we've discussed those subjects, I don't want to discuss them again under the name of St. Peter. But I do want to talk just momentarily about the authorship of this epistle and the other general epistles, which sometimes it's very difficult for us to pinpoint a date of authorship. Of course, he died around the year 65, so it has to be before then. Some people say that St. Peter could not have written this epistle because it's in Greek, and Peter was an uneducated fisherman from Galilee, okay? So, first of all, he probably knew some Greek before he even met Jesus because he's from Galilee, and Galilee was a very mixed area. And not only did the apostles who were from that region have some knowledge of Greek, maybe not complete fluency, but some knowledge, they would have had something to build on. But they also, some of them have Greek names, and I've mentioned this before, like Andrew and Philip. These are Greek names. So this was a very Hellenized area. Now, that doesn't mean that he was necessarily fluent in Greek or could write a beautiful epistle such as this one, but that doesn't mean that he is not the author, because we have to get away from this idea that he just sat down with his quill and ink and just composed this whole thing all by himself. Letters were very collaborative, and this is something that biblical studies has only recently come to appreciate. That's why it's really difficult now. They find themselves biblical scholars who said, Paul definitely wrote this, and Paul definitely did not write that. And yet at the same time, they're kind of coming around to the realization that Paul had a lot of help. He had secretaries, he had people who wrote for him, who did the actual writing, even if he was the one who did the phrasing. So the letters in antiquity, especially these letters, which were considered very long, even though this is a short epistle, usually you didn't have written letters that were as long as this in antiquity. They would be one sheet of papyrus, and maybe front and back if you really needed a lot to say. But mostly they were not very long at all. So most of the books in the New Testament are really long, by first century standards. And so this has been attributed to Peter. I don't see any reason why Peter could not or would not have written this or been responsible for the content. And whatever shortcomings he had in the Greek language, if he had any, then he had people who could help him. And this doesn't mean it's not inspired just because somebody corrected his grammar if that was necessary. I do the same thing. I don't dare write even a short letter in Greek without having Father Costa look at it. I'm not fluent in Greek. Maybe I knew as much as Peter, maybe less than Peter, but you don't want to look like an ignoramus. So you have somebody who's a native speaker look over your writing and make sure that it's grammatically correct. That doesn't mean that Peter's not the author, just as all kinds of important and famous people who are heads of industry, who lead big companies, who are politicians, they don't sit down and write every single letter by hand and type it themselves. They have a secretary that does that for them. But the secretary or the speechwriter knows the personality of the author. So when the president or, a famous person says, I want to send a letter to so-and-so and tell them this, they know what to say because they've worked with that person and they know their themes and they know their ideas and their areas of emphasis, etc. So this is why it's kind of ridiculous to say, well, Peter couldn't have written it because Peter's Greek couldn't be that good. The same thing with James. We sort of talked about this with the Epistle of James. It's very silly. It's very shallow. And it's very immature thinking. Okay, so don't give any thought to that at all. We don't have to have such simplistic views. And by the way, 1 Peter was never disputed in the early church, and neither was 1 John. These epistles were always recognized as genuine in the early church. So you don't have that question of in the early church so much. So what do I want to focus on in terms of this epistle of 1 Peter? I want to talk about his references to rock and stone, because it has a lot to do with his name, Peter, the rock. He mentions it here. So I want to talk about that. Also, what's unique about 1 Peter is he's the one who mentions the royal priesthood. Have you ever heard that term? That's called the priesthood of all believers. So that there's something that we have certain qualities of priesthood in every single believer. And we call that the royal priesthood. And that comes from St. Peter's Epistle, chapter 2, verse 9, in case you didn't know that. And also, St. Peter mentions Christ's descent into Hades. He talks about how the dead received the gospel or were preached the gospel. That's in chapter 4, verse 6. I think that's important for you to know. You probably know about this. We do have this tradition in the church where we talk about the fact that the Lord, after he died on Friday, he went to Hades and preached to the dead, so that everybody had the opportunity to hear his message, to receive him, accept him, or not. So that's what happened, and he does mention this. But for now, I want to talk about his life and his martyrdom, and then we will also talk about St. John Chrysostom. Boy, I have the most wonderful sermon for you on St. Peter by St. John Chrysostom, but you'll have to hold on for that one, all right? First, let's talk about his life and his martyrdom. I think that no apostle cuts such a vivid figure as St. Peter. And perhaps we know more about St. Paul because he wrote more books, and he's the subject of the majority of the book of Acts of the Apostles. Peter is the main subject at the beginning, then it switches to Paul. So we know a lot about Paul, more than about Paul maybe than Peter. But Peter is the one whose personality we really get a sense of, don't you think so? He's kind of brash and energetic and enthusiastic, and of course, he was passionately devoted to Christ. In that respect, he was just like St. Paul. St. Paul said, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And I'm sure Peter would have agreed with him about this. St. Peter is called the leader of the apostles, the chief apostle. And this this description is found frequently among the fathers of the church. It's in our hymnography. As a matter of fact, the hymn, the Apologikion, or the hymn of St. Andrew, talks about how he's the brother of the leader of the apostles. So this was very widely recognized in the church, of course, and the Gospels really bear witness to his natural leadership qualities. It's not a surprise that he was so prominent among the other disciples, and this is why he became their leader. It's not like they had to put it to a vote or anything. He was just always the one who spoke up. He was the one who was willing to do these things, speak for Jesus and defend Jesus and all of these other things. So St. Peter probably met Jesus for the first time at the synagogue in Capernaum because there was an exorcism that took place. Now, Capernaum was a major town in Galilee on the seashore, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is a freshwater lake, you know. And he brought Jesus home from church, basically, because his mother-in-law was home sick with a fever. So we all know that story where Jesus just touched her and she recovered and she began to wait on them. Remember, Peter brought Jesus home from the synagogue, and maybe it's because he saw the exorcism which had taken place at the synagogue. Now later, Jesus continues his preaching. He travels all around the different towns and villages, and then he came back to Capernaum and he saw Peter and Andrew and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Peter and Andrew being brothers, you know, and James and John, and they were mending their nets. They had been fishing all night. They hadn't caught a thing. And Jesus asked Peter if he could get in his boat, and if Jesus could get in the boat and go a little bit offshore so he could preach to the people. Well, why would Jesus want to sit in a boat while the people stood or sat on the shore? Because there were so many of them, and they were always straining forward to touch him, that he was often almost swallowed up by the crowd. He was almost crushed by the crowd. So he sat in the boat. Peter said, of course. Jesus got in the boat. He did his lesson. He spoke to the people. And then he said to Peter, just go out and drop your net on the right side. Go out to the deep. Drop your net on the right side. He says, we've been fishing all night. We're not going to catch anything. He didn't think he was going to catch anything. But he did what Jesus said, and he had a phenomenal catch of fish, so much that the boats, because he was in partnership with James and John, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they were about to sink. And the nets were breaking. So we see, first of all, his obedience, and we see his humility. That these were natural qualities that he already had, because he certainly did not really know that much about Jesus at this time. So when they returned to the shore, what does Simon do? Because that's his real name, right? Simon. He fell at Jesus's feet and said what? Do you remember? This is in the Gospel of Luke. Depart from me, Master, for I am a sinful man. He was overwhelmed by the holiness of Christ. It's not that he was such a great sinner. He wasn't a great sinner. But he recognized the divinity of Christ, at least the power of God working through Jesus Christ. And Jesus, after that, he left everything. They all four of them left everything, began to follow the Lord. So there are more stories about Simon Peter than about any other disciple in the Gospels. He's the one who asked Jesus for permission to walk on the water. He's the one who runs to the empty tomb and then bursts into it. He's the one who made the great confession about Peter, about Jesus, for which he got his nickname, Peter. And I want to read to you about that. We're going to talk about that event when he received this extraordinary blessing from Jesus. And I'm going to read to you right now from St. John Chrysostom. This is not the really incredible excerpt I have to read to you. You'll have to wait for that. But here's what St. John Chrysostom said, because what happened was the disciples had been preaching, and Jesus wanted to know what they were saying about Jesus. And then some of them said, well, you're John the Baptist come alive again, or they thought maybe Jesus was Elijah or Jeremiah, one of the other prophets. And then Jesus turns the tables on them and says, but who do you say that I am? So here's St. John Chrysostom from Homily 52 on the Gospel of Matthew. Next he added, "But who do you say that I am?" Calling them on by his second question to entertain some higher thoughts concerning him, indicating that their former judgment falls exceedingly short of his dignity. Wherefore he asks for another judgment from themselves, that they might not share the same judgment as the multitude, who, because they saw his miracles as greater than human, still considered him a human being. Do you see that? Isn't that interesting? It's not like Jesus was just curious, well, who do you say that I am? What do the people say that I am? But here Chrysostom is telling us that he wants them to realize that he's not just a man with extraordinary powers. So continuing with Chrysostom, what then said the mouth of the apostles, Peter, the ever fervent, the leader of the apostolic choir, when all are asked, he answered. Whereas he asked the opinion of the people in reply to the question, when the Lord asked their own opinion, Peter springs forward and says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And what did Christ say? "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it to you." Surely, unless he had rightly confessed him as being begotten of the Father himself, this would be no work of revelation. For he had accounted our Lord to be one of the many. If he had accounted the Lord to be one of the many, his saying would not be worthy of a blessing. In other words, Peter recognizes that Jesus is not just a mere prophet, but the Son of the living God. And this could only come by illumination from God the Father, who revealed that to him. So even others who said he is the Son of God, when they saw him, those who were in the boat after the storm, because that happened too, remember, they were not blessed like this because they didn't consider him a son like Peter did, the way that Peter expressed it. This is Chrysostom's opinion, but as one of many, because the idea of Son of God is a title that was used for holy men. So they didn't mean it in the fullest extent, the way Peter meant it. That's why Peter received the blessing, because he was the first person to make that kind of statement, indicating the fullness of the meaning. Now, the same thing, now Chrysostom brings forward the example of Nathanael. Now, do you remember this? When the Lord meets Nathanael, this is in the Gospel of John, and he says, "I saw you under the fig tree." Nathanael has an exclamation about Jesus, and he says, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." And Chrysostom says this, "Far from being blessed, he is even reproved by Christ, as having said what was far short of the truth. He replied, 'Because I said this to you, that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than this.'" So why is this man blessed? He's speaking of Peter. These are the words of St. John Chrysostom. So listen to this carefully. This is Chrysostom. "Because Peter acknowledged Christ as the very Son." Now, it's not the words of friendship and flattery, of a disposition to show favor to him, that he brings forward the person that made him ring in his soul, to inform him that Peter spoke, but the Father had suggested it. And Chrysostom goes on to talk about how this is, the confession is a statement of the reality of we would say that the Son is one in essence with the Father, that he is truly the Son of God in his essence. So this is why Christ said, "You are Simon, son of Jonas, and you will be called Cephas, or Cephas Petros." And that's why Jesus said, "You are Peter, you're the son of Jonah." And he's making the comparison because just as you are the son of Jonas, I am the son of my Father. And this is Chrysostom's words. "Or else it would be superfluous to say you are the son of Jonah. But since he said, you are the Son of God, to point out that Christ really is the Son of God, and the other is the son of Jonas, to be the same substance with him that begat him. I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, that is, on the faith of his confession. Okay? So, at any rate, that gives you the idea, you can understand why he says, you are the son of this man, and I am truly, in essence, the Son of the Father. That's a very excellent insight, I think, on the part of St. John Chrysostom. Well, we have a caller calling in, and let's see. It's Peter. Is Peter the Pope of the Church? Is that the question? Who's calling in today? Oh, Dario from Illinois. Hello, Dario. Are you there? I can't hear you. We don't have a clear connection.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, very good. Now I can hear you. Thank you very much. Okay, so go ahead.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I'm hearing an echo in the back. Dario, can you speak up?
Hello. Can
Yes.
you hear me now?
I can hear you. Very good. So what is your question or comment?
Yes.
Go ahead.
My question is,
Are you listening to the program behind you? Because
My
if you
question
are, you're
is,
getting mixed up.
could you
'Cause-
explain?
Yes.
Yes.
You need. That's why you're supposed to lower your volume, because you're hearing it delayed
Okay.
and you're getting
Okay,
confused. Were you going to
I'm
ask
hearing you.
about Peter?
Okay,
Let me just
yes.
ask you this
My
question.
question is, could you please explain why the Catholic Church claims that verse in Matthew
Yes.
supports the claim that Peter is supposed to be the head of the church, and therefore the successor of Peter, the Pope in Rome, should be the head of the church. So I guess there are 2 points here.
Yes.
One, that Peter is supposed to be the head of the church, and 2, that the Bishop of Rome, the successor of Peter, should therefore be the head of the church.
Head of the whole
So if you
church,
could
yes.
explain-
I'm going to explain
why
that.
that is wrong.
Okay. Yes, as a matter of fact, I was planning to explain that on this program. Can you hang up and listen to the explanation, because it's kind of lengthy?
I will
Is that
do
all right?
immediately. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks for
admire you very
calling,
much.
Dario.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. Thanks for calling. Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Okay, so here we have this extraordinary event that Dario was talking about, where Jesus says, "You are Peter, Petros, and on this Petra, rock, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." But the first time the word is Petros, that's his name, Peter, and the second time it's the word Petra, which is feminine. So we're going to talk about what does that mean. Now, before we get to that, however, I wanted to finish talking about his life, if that's okay. So Dario's going to have to hold on just a little bit longer, okay? But this is why, that answer is actually given to us in this epistle. What does it mean that Peter was called the rock, and does it support the Catholic claim? So we're definitely going to get to that. But I wanted you to hear how Chrysostom explained why he was given that. And actually, Chrysostom gives us the answer to Dario's question at the end, where he said, the rock is the faith. It's the confession that Peter made, not himself. The church is not built upon a person, but I will demonstrate that for you as we continue. Okay? So Peter receives this extraordinary blessing, but all of the ability to forgive sins, right? And the keys to the kingdom of heaven, etc. But all of the apostles receive this ability and this blessing, by the way, later. We also see his leadership because he played a strong role at the Council of Jerusalem, where all of the apostles got together to discuss whether or not the Gentile Christians had to observe the law of Moses, all the rules of the Jewish law. We see St. Peter in Acts of the Apostles, healing a paralytic, raising Dorcas or Tabitha from the dead, healing a blind man, escaping from prison, this miraculous escape from prison. And then when he leaves Jerusalem, he goes to Antioch, where he spent a great deal of time at the church of Antioch. Antioch was associated with Peter in antiquity more than it was with Rome because he spent a lot of time in Antioch. And then he continued to travel westward, passing through lots of different towns, including Corinth, where he spent some time. And we know that there's historical verification of this. He traveled, eventually he ends up in Rome, where he is martyred. And he travels with his wife. St. Paul told us in his epistle in 1 Corinthians that, or 2 Corinthians, that he was traveling, that the apostles were traveling with their wives. And of course, remember that these apostles were married. They also had children. And we know that St. Peter had at least one daughter who is a saint, St. Petronilla, who is commemorated on May 31st. So some people, being ridiculous, have said that there's no evidence that Peter was ever in Rome. But it's ridiculous. I don't know what they mean by evidence. The traditions about St. Peter dying in Rome are so numerous, and there's virtually no other tradition about him dying anyplace else or in any other manner except to die under Nero in the first Roman persecution around the year 65. And we know that this epistle would have been written before then, maybe very close to the time of his death, because we know that St. Peter was in Rome when he wrote this, because at the end of the epistle, he says this in chapter 5, verse 13, "She who is in Babylon sends you greetings along with my son Mark." Now, who's the she and what's the Babylon? She is the church. The church, it was like a code of saying the church in Rome, Babylon is Rome, because it was this huge city and it was full of all kinds of immorality. So they called it Babylon. So the church in Babylon sends you greetings along with Mark. And we know that this is one reason why Mark is said to have written his gospel from Rome, or in Rome, because he was accompanying St. Peter. And there's a lot of patristic testimony that St. Mark wrote down what Peter what he heard Peter teaching and preaching. This is told to us by Clement of Alexandria, but by Pius of Hierapolis, by Eusebius of Caesarea. And in a letter dated around the year 171, Dionysius, the bishop of Corinth, wrote to the Church of Rome and states that Peter visited Corinth on his way to Rome, that both Peter and Paul taught in Corinth and suffered martyrdom under Nero in Rome. So we've reached the half hour, so we're going to take a break here. When we return, we'll continue talking about St. Peter, and we have a call to take upon our return from the break. All right? Join us after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hello, Elisa Bielatich of Everyday Orthodox.
Well, hi there, Bobby Maddox, station manager of Ancient Faith Radio.
Hey, so I wanted to talk to you about creating a promo for the great lineup of family-related programming currently available at ancientfaith.com.
Ah, cool. You know, there are actually a lot of resources on the site for Orthodox families of all shapes and sizes.
Including a few that you've had a hand in?
That is true.
I'm talking, of course, about Tending the Garden of Our Hearts, which you record with Christina Wenger, and that features weekly meditations for families with stories about the saints, scripture readings, and lessons designed to open up conversation and to enrich the little church of the home. And then there's the podcast Raising Saints, in which you offer tools to equip adults to share the Orthodox Christian faith with children. Help me out, Elisa. What else does AFR provide with regard to the family?
Well, let's see. You mentioned Christina, and she's also the woman behind Let Us Attend, which is a podcast that paraphrases the Sunday Gospel for younger and older children. And, don't forget about Family Matters, in which the Center for Family Care, which is a ministry of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, nurtures and empowers families, helping them navigate the joys and challenges of life. And, of course, Annalisa Boyd has her own podcast called The Ascetic Lives of Mothers that serves as an encouragement for mamas parenting children through all their different ages and stages. That's 5 podcasts right there, Bobby.
And now there's a 6th.
Really?
Yeah, I'm very happy to announce the debut of All These Things with Hannah Vasquez. Hannah is a wife and mother of 4, with 1 on the way, who offers encouragement and inspiration, as well as practical tips to mothers as they navigate the responsibilities with all these things: homemaking, childcare, food preparation, etc., while trying to stay focused on seeking the kingdom.
Wow, that's a lot of family content, and it definitely deserves a promo. So when should we record it?
We just did.
I guess we did, didn't we? So are we done here?
Yep. Thank you, Elisa Bielatich.
So long, Bobby Maddox.
Bringing fresh air to a polluted world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
All right, so we're back, and we have a call from Nick in Washington State. Are you with us, Nick? Hello? Are you there, Nick? All right, well, we'll have to come back to Nick because he's not responding right now. But are you there? One more try. Are you, very good. Are you there, Nick?
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, I can.
Yes. Am I coming through
Thanks
loud and
for
clear?
calling. Yes, you are. Thanks for calling, Nick. What's your question or comment?
Yes, I wanted to support what you talked about when Christ said in Matthew 16, verse 18, he said, "And I say to you, you are Peter, Petros, which is in the masculine, and on this rock, Petra, which is the statement of faith, is in the feminine."
Mm-hmm.
So the implication a lot of times that people think that it was based on Peter, the person, rather than his statement of faith.
Right.
But I don't know whether you brought that out or not, but I just wanted to point that out. That,
Yes, thank you. Well, that's
the
your.
rock. The rock.
Yes, I think it's interesting because it's in a different gender, also in Latin, which is quite interesting because now in English we don't have gender for nouns unless it's a man or a woman or a male or female animal. Rocks don't have gender in the English language, but it does in Greek and other languages. Common ordinary nouns have gender, right? So it would be easy to understand why in English you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church. It's easy to understand why somebody would make that mistake in English, but not in Greek and not even in Latin, because Latin also has the second word rock as feminine. But we're going to get to that because I'm going to explain that very carefully, hopefully to your satisfaction. Do you have...
I'm sorry,
That's okay.
I didn't mean to jump. Yeah,
no, it's you and Dario and quite a few listeners out there are already many steps ahead of me, but we will get to that question. Would you like to add anything else, Nick?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thanks for calling.
I just wanted to supplement what you had been saying.
Very good.
An observation. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. G.
Excellent. Thank you for calling, Nick. Good night. Okay, so yes, we're going to talk about that. I'm going to explain what Petra is. It's so obvious once you know. But thanks for calling, Nick. So let's go back to the martyrdom of St. Peter. So both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome under Nero. Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen, and that's the way an execution was carried out for a Roman citizen. But Peter was not a Roman citizen. He was a Roman subject, and he was crucified. Now, not everybody, there were exactly 977 Christians who were martyred under Nero in the first Roman persecution of Christians. Maybe when we discuss the Epistle to the Romans, I will tell you more details about what happened. But many of them, different things were done to them, but many of them were crucified, including St. Peter. And it is very well known that he was crucified upside down. Now, the reason why he was crucified upside down is not exactly known. There are three suggestions which I have heard. First is this was done by Roman soldiers to amuse themselves, okay? I don't know about that. We do know that sometimes the Roman soldiers, because they got bored with crucifying people, they would position their arms and legs in funny positions just to amuse themselves. We know that. But the problem with that is this. A person died by crucifixion because they were hanging forward from their arms and slowly suffocated to death because they couldn't get enough oxygen. That wouldn't happen if you're hanging upside down, okay? That could not happen if you're hanging upside down because the weight of your body would not be, I think that would not happen. So I don't know that that's the reason, but I'm not 100% positive. Another explanation I heard was that he felt unworthy to die as Christ did. That's possible. But I don't know for sure because I don't know where that explanation has come from. It's just something that I heard once. Now, there's a theological explanation that's given in an apocryphal work called the Acts of Peter. Now, this Acts of Peter also supports the tradition that Peter died crucified upside down, and this is dated no later than the year 200, which is fairly early, but it's highly embellished. And in the this is Apocrypha. That means that it's not really written by Peter, but it's sort of an embellished version of some acts of his life. When he's asked to be crucified upside down in the Acts of Peter, he gives this very long, very elaborate theological explanation I don't think Peter would have actually given when he was about to be crucified. But here's what it is, that when your head is downward, it shows the manner of birth, okay? Like you're dead, like you're being pulled down. He says he's in his human mortal body. It's like when you're born upside down with your head coming out first, right? And so you're born into this world and you're born with sins, and then you're pulled down farther to the earth because we commit sins. But it's a very kind of big paragraph of theological explanation. He says, the way you see me hanging, and he's saying all this from the cross, is according to the Acts of Peter. The way you see me hanging is a representation of that man that first came into birth, for it is right to mount upon the cross of Christ, who is the word stretched out. And he says the nails are the conversion and repentance of man. So there's this whole poetic and theological embellishment. So we can't say for certain why he was crucified upside down, but that he was crucified upside down is absolutely true. And I will share with you another very interesting story about St. Peter that I heard from one of my friends who's a seminarian in Rome. And when I went last summer, thank God, Christopher and I went to Rome last summer, and we met up with one of my former students who's from the University of San Diego, who's now, or who was in Rome studying for the priesthood, for the Catholic priesthood. And he told me about this story, and I found out where it's from. It's also from the apocryphal Acts of Peter, but in the Latin tradition. And this story shows up only in Latin, so I don't know about it. It's much later. Could it have happened? Yeah, it could have happened. It's a nice story, but it's not in the original Greek version of the Acts of Peter. So, yes, maybe you heard of this movie a long time ago called Quo Vadis. Remember back in the 50s? Well, I don't remember them personally, but if you remember, in the 1950s, there were all these religious movies that were being, made by Hollywood, The Robe and the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur and all those. Well, there was one called Quo Vadis, which I actually haven't seen, but maybe I should. And this refers to this tradition regarding St. Peter. According to the Latin version of the apocryphal Acts of Peter, Peter knew that he was going to be crucified in Rome, so he left the city, and as he was leaving the city, he met the risen Christ. And Peter asks Jesus, Quo vadis, which means, where are you going? And Jesus said, I am going to Rome to be crucified again. And so Peter turned around and returned to the city where he was martyred by being crucified upside down. And there's a church in Rome called the Church of Domine Quo Vadis, Lord, where are you going? that's what that means, Domine Quo Vadis, is built supposedly on the site where Peter met the risen Jesus. So maybe this really happened. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. But the words Quo Vadis, where are you going, occur several times in the Latin version of the Gospels. And where does it occur? Can you think of it? In the Gospel of John, when Jesus is giving his farewell discourse to the disciples. He says, I'm leaving. And they said, Lord, where are you going? They kept asking where and he says, where I'm going, you can't come, but you'll follow me. I'm going to prepare a place for you. Lord, where are you going? We want to come too. Lord, I'll follow you wherever you go. So that question, where are you going, is really very, very poignant. So that's the story. I like it anyhow. All right, so let's talk about the upside down cross as the symbol of St. Peter, which it was for centuries. Now, as I said, 977 people died as martyrs in this first Roman persecution under Nero. The two most famous were Peter and Paul. And those two became symbols of all these people who died, and especially of the apostles. They were like the heroes of the Church of Rome. That, the martyrs are our boast, our pride. And Rome had the two greatest, the apostle to the Gentiles and the apostle to the Jews, to the circumcised, and to the uncircumcised and the circumcised. Peter and Paul both died in Rome, and their relics are even there today, these many years later. And initially, we see in art, in depictions, various kinds of church depictions, both of those apostles are together all the time. They're on coins, and there's little engravings and different, mosaics and things like this. Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul, Peter and Paul. And they were commemorated together, and they still are, right? On June 29th in the new calendar, which is the same date, by the way, in the Catholic Church. It's a feast day of Saints Peter and Paul. Even though they probably didn't actually die on the same day, that's the day, and we commemorate both of them. So they're the twin heroes, but slowly St. Paul was dropped, okay? And in favor of Peter by himself. And guess what? The image of St. Peter, which is the upside down cross, that's the symbol of St. Peter in all the early presentations of the symbols. Remember, all of the martyrs have the method of their martyrdom is shown, is the symbol of that saint. This I'm getting all mixed up here. The symbol of the saint is the tool that was used to kill them, basically, okay? So the sword is the symbol of St. Paul. The upside-down cross is the symbol of St. Peter. That's the ancient symbol of St. Peter. So that was always the image of St. Peter, and he was always shown with Paul until gradually Paul was dropped in favor of Peter alone, and the image of Peter, the symbol of Peter, was changed to the keys. From the words of Christ, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, which is right after St. Peter makes his famous confession. So why did that happen? Well, this goes to the question that people have been calling in to ask about. It has to do with the effort on by the bishops of Rome to increase their importance basically within the church. And that is why slowly the image of Paul was dropped and the upside down cross of Peter was dropped in favor of the keys. And Rome always calling itself the Apostolic See. I always chuckle at that. I find that very funny because it's as if there is no other Apostolic See. Actually every church, practically every town in the Middle East and in Greece the church was founded by an apostle who came through there, and so many other places. So it's not the only Apostolic See, but what happened is that the Church of Rome, the bishops of Rome, wanted to assert themselves and to sort of flex their muscle and have more authority in the church. They were always trying to do this. Now, this is not unusual, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not ascribing evil motives to these bishops of Rome. That's before they had the name Pope. They weren't always called the Pope. It was very common for a bishop of an important episcopal see, an important city, to try to exert influence or to be helpful, not to be power hungry necessarily, but to be helpful. When he saw something going on in another place that he thought was wrong, to write them a letter and say, you know what, maybe you should not do that anymore. So we see this happening in Rome, but also, to be fair, we see Alexandria do that. The Bishop of Alexandria is the one who removed St. John Chrysostom. He came all the way from Alexandria, Egypt, went to Constantinople, and held a council to get rid of Chrysostom. Okay? Chrysostom got involved in the affairs of the church in Ephesus. Now, normally, bishops are not allowed to exercise influence any place outside their sphere, outside their city. But important bishops often do. So this is not just unique to the Bishop of Rome. But what is unique is that the Bishop of Rome had all these statements about St. Peter that they used to create a whole theology about Peter and the authority of Peter and Rome. And this is the basis for the Catholic Church's claim that the church is founded on St. Peter and that he was the Bishop of Rome. And subsequent people who were the bishops of Rome after Peter all inherit this authority over the entire world. Now, I'm also going to tell you that there were Eastern bishops who talk about, they might write letters to the Bishop of Rome and talk about them as the Church of Love, and they're the successor of Peter and all this. There was a kind of, there's a sort of formality among bishops where they praise each other and they give themselves and each other these very flowery titles. But we don't take that as seriously as the Catholic Church takes it. So, first of all, let me say that the entire church has always recognized the primacy of the Church of Rome. But the question is, what does that mean? Well, the East has always called it a primacy of honor, not of jurisdiction. That means that they had the place of honor, that when there was going to be a meeting at which all of the bishops were present, the Bishop of Rome would preside because he was protos. He had the place of the first place. First among equals is how it was described. But notice that you have that statement of equality because all bishops are equal in the church. Now, you may not know that because maybe your bishop is called an archbishop or he's a metropolitan or maybe he's just plain bishop. They're still just bishops. There's nothing above a bishop. As a matter of fact, St. Cyprian, who lived in the middle of the 3rd century, was revolting against the Bishop of Rome. Revolting is a strong word. The Bishop of Rome was trying to exercise influence over the church in North Africa, where Cyprian was. He was the Bishop of Carthage. And he was trying to get the people in Carthage to do what he said. And Cyprian had already held a council and made certain decisions. And the Bishop of Rome did not agree with them. So Cyprian said, no one can be a bishop of bishops. In other words, there's no such thing as a bishop who is above other bishops, who has more power or more authority over any other bishop. In the Orthodox Church, we keep the ancient order, and that is that our bishops meet together in councils and they decide everything all together. Whoever is presiding is the person who has either seniority or has the most important position among them, but it has to do with usually the importance of their see, of the place where they are established as a bishop. Now, St. Peter was never the Bishop of Rome. That might come as a surprise to you. Well, why do I say that? Because bishops were consecrated by the apostles, and they were consecrated to a specific place. The Greek Archdiocese, we have our bishop in San Francisco. We have the metropolis of San Francisco. This bishop was consecrated to that particular see. Okay? So a bishop, he can't just decide one day to move to Denver or Atlanta or Toronto. He is the bishop of that place, and he can only exercise his authority as a bishop within the metropolis of San Francisco. It's a very big metropolis, all of the western states in the United States. So we have some big areas out here because we're kind of spread apart. So the bishop's jurisdiction is limited to his area. Peter was not a bishop. He was an apostle. That was much, much higher than a bishop. He was the one who chose the bishop. The first bishop of Rome was actually Linus. Okay. But later, because of all of this kind of, I hate to put it, I don't want to say propaganda, but it's kind of like that. All of the talk about Peter being the first bishop, being the first bishop, being the first bishop, all of this was cultivated slowly over time by the bishops of Rome. Now, the very first bishop of Rome ever to apply that statement in Matthew, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, was Leo the Great. And do you know when he lived? Around the year 450. So it's more than 300 years, more than 400 years after the time that Christ said that. So Leo is the one who begins this whole theology about Peter and tying it to these statements that supposedly he gave Peter all this, Jesus gave Peter all this special authority. Now, why did he do that? Actually, I have a lot of sympathy for the bishops of Rome. What happened is that Rome began to be in decline, and Leo the Great, Leo the First, Bishop of Rome, saw this happening under his watch. You know, Rome had been invaded, it was conquered, and the West slowly came under the control of barbarian powers. And so the bishops of Rome had to insist on a lot more authority just to sort of maintain their maintain life as best they could and the church as best they could. So, and of course they were the only ones who were able to do that. But we know that the reason why Rome was first is not because of Peter. The reason why Rome has primacy is not because of Peter, but because it was the capital of the empire. So how do we know that? We know that for many reasons, but the best reason is because in the year 381, at the Second Ecumenical Council, the city of Constantinople was officially recognized as second after Rome in these ranks of honor. We call that the Pentarchy. These are ranks of honor. So Constantinople did not even exist at the time of Christ. So it was a new city. It had been built by Constantine. It was maybe 50 years old at the time of the council. But the whole church at this ecumenical council passed a canon giving Constantinople second place, and then Alexandria, then Antioch, and then Jerusalem. So we have these patriarchates, ancient patriarchates. Now, the reason why that's significant is that it tells us that Rome was first, not because of any particular connection to Peter, but because it was the Roman capital, the capital of the empire. And Constantinople was New Rome. It was the eastern capital. That's why it's second. So that's why the ecumenical patriarchate, the patriarch in Constantinople, is the sort of head of the Orthodox Church. And he follows the ancient order. He doesn't try to get involved in the affairs of all these other churches. He does have a primacy of honor over all the other Orthodox churches because if there's a meeting, he's going to preside. But he doesn't have the right to interfere in the workings of other churches because everything is done by council in the Orthodox Church, not because one person makes a decision and tries to implement it. But we still haven't explained yet about this word Petra. So I think we're going to have to explain it after the break. But first I'm going to read from the first epistle of Peter, where he uses this very word, okay? And when we come back from the break, I will explain it to you. So, oh, by the way, no ancient interpreter thought that the church was founded on St. Peter. That is entirely as I mentioned, this begins really with Leo the Great, but later popes added to it and they enlarged it in order to emphasize their authority. Now, the Bishop of Rome was the only member of the Pentarchy that had authority, had jurisdiction over Western Europe. So he did have a lot of influence and say over what was happening in Western Europe. But what we see in the church in the West is that they begin to make the bishops nothing more than, the bishops really lose all of their authority to operate independently. And that's still the case in the Catholic Church. And I've had Catholics argue with me about this, but it's the truth, even though they have councils. There's a council of United Council of Catholic bishops here in America, but any decision that they make has to be approved by Rome or can be undone by the Pope. So that means that they really don't have authority to make decisions on their own. So let's read from 1 Peter chapter 2. Put away all malice and guile and insincerity and envy and all slander. Like newborn babes, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up to salvation, for you have tasted the kindness of the Lord. Come to him, to that living stone, rejected by men, but in God's sight chosen and precious, and like living stones, be yourselves built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and he who believes in him will not be put to shame. That's Isaiah 28. To you, therefore, who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. That's a quotation of Psalm 117. And a stone that will make men stumble, a rock that will make them fall. That's from Isaiah 43. For they stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do so. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So he mentions the word rock there, a stone that will make men stumble, a rock that will make them fall. That's Isaiah 43. And who is he talking about? He's talking about Jesus Christ. So let's take a break, and I'm going to unpack that for you after the break, okay?
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Reading through the entire Bible in just 1 year. To an average person in today's busy world, it seems like a daunting challenge. But in the Orthodox Daily Scriptures podcast, Father Alexis Khoury makes it a journey that is not only rewarding, but simple and accessible as well.
They buried their bones under the oak tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his lawlessness, which he committed against the Lord according to the word of the Lord, because he did not keep it, and because Saul sought counsel of a wizard, and Samuel the prophet answered him. So he slew him and turned the kingdom over to David.
To find this podcast and others like it, you can go to ancientfaith.com.
Bringing fresh air to a polluted world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we're talking about 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter says, come to him, that living stone. He's describing Jesus as a stone. The word stone is lithos, L-I-T-H-O-S, lithos. Okay? Be like living stones yourselves. Build a spiritual house. Then he quotes the scriptures, which are prophecies about the Messiah. I'm laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone. And therefore you who believe he's precious, but those who do not believe, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. That's a prophecy that Jesus quoted to the Jewish authorities who didn't believe in him. So Jesus called himself the stone. So Jesus is both the stone, lithos, and the rock, Petra. Now, Peter is the one who is referring to Petra as Christ, not to himself. And he knew that the church was not founded on him. How do we know that Peter knows the church is not founded on him? Because even though he was the mouthpiece of the apostles, he got up on the day of Pentecost and preached to everybody. He did not make decisions by himself for the whole church. When they were going to decide about whether or not they should replace Judas, Peter got up and makes a speech and says, brothers, I think we should replace Judas. What do you think? And they all agreed. Okay, so he doesn't make decisions by himself. They made decisions as a group, always. So even though Peter is the voice of the apostles, he doesn't assert that kind of authority like a dictator, making all the decisions for the church, and never considered himself, God forbid, to be the foundation of the church. The church cannot be founded on a person. The church is only founded on Christ. And here you go. Now, even St. Paul used the term Petra to refer to Christ, rock, in 1 Corinthians 10:3. And we'll read it to you. I want you, brethren, to know that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same supernatural rock, and all drank the same supernatural drink. For they drank from the supernatural rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. And the word there is Petra, the same thing that we see in Matthew 16:18. You are 16:16. You are Peter. You are rock, Petros. And on this rock, Petra, I will build my church. That what Peter said is that Jesus is the Son of the living God. That's the foundation of the church, you see, not Peter, the human being. So why would both Peter and Paul call Jesus a rock? Because Christ himself referred to himself as the stone, and the Old Testament scriptures refer to God as rock and stone. The Lord is my rock and my salvation. Okay? The Lord is the defender of my life. Those statements are in Greek. The word is Petra. And so when they were hearing that word or reading it in the Gospel of Matthew, you are Petra, you are Petros, and on this Petra, everybody in the ancient church knew that the word that refers to God as rock is Petra. Now, that's much more common in Hebrew. Very often in the Septuagint, rather than simply translating it as rock, it will say, the Lord is my strength in Greek, and salvation. In Hebrew, it will say rock, okay? But in the Greek, sometimes it's translated as strength or something else, my shelter, my strength, my foundation. But definitely, Petra is used to refer to God in the Septuagint, okay? And everybody understood this. So where else do we see this? In Luke, when Jesus says, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. And by the way, Jesus also refers to his teachings as the rock. In Matthew, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the wind blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. That's in Matthew at the end of chapter 7. So it is Christ who identifies himself as the rock and the stone, two different words. Just like we have two different words in English, rock and stone, there are two different words in the Bible, but that refers to Christ. So you see, it was very obvious to all of the primitive interpreters, to the apostles, to all the early fathers, both Greek and Latin, that this church was founded not on St. Peter, but on the Petra, and that is the rock, which is Christ himself. So let's take a look at Chrysostom's interpretation. Well, I told you that already. He says that, and I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. That is, Chrysostom says, on the faith of his confession. But let's not listen to Chrysostom. Let's take a look at what St. Augustine said about it, because, of course, he is the great Latin father. For Peter, this is, he's commenting here on how the Lord was walking on the waves of the sea, and Peter asked if he can come out and join him. For Peter, in the order of the apostles first, and in the love of Christ most forward, answers oftentimes alone for all the rest. And when Jesus Christ, because he asked to come out and meet him on the water, and when Jesus Christ asked whom men said that he was, and when the disciples gave various opinions of men, and the Lord again said, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." For one of many gave the answer. And then the Lord said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonas, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Then he added, "I say to you, because you have said to me, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God,' I also say, you are Peter. For before he was called Simon." This is St. Augustine. "Now this name of Peter was given to him by the Lord, and that in a figure, that he should signify the church. For seeing that Christ is the rock, Petra, Peter Petros is also the Christian people. For the rock, Petra, is the original name. So Peter is called from the rock, not the rock from Peter. As Christ is not called Christ from the Christian, but the Christian from Christ." Did you follow that? That was pretty good. So he's saying that he gave Peter the name Petros because Christ himself, rock, because Christ is the rock, Petra, you see, the derivative. Just as we are not called Christians because Christ didn't get his title Christian from us, but we get the title or the term Christian from him, you see. "Therefore he said, you are Peter, and upon this rock which you have confessed, upon this rock which you have acknowledged, saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, I will build my church. That is, upon myself, the Son of the living God, will I build my church. I will build you upon myself, not myself upon you." Isn't that amazing? That's St. Augustine. So I keep this in my computer because I hate to say this. I have to give it to my Catholic students, pretty often, because of course this is some of you called in, like Dario called in and Nick called in to talk about this. They are told from the time of infancy that the church is founded upon St. Peter. And look at here, St. Augustine, who was even, almost lived to the time of, he wouldn't have agreed with Leo the Great, and him saying that the church is founded on St. Peter. But Christ is saying here, Augustine is saying here, that Christ said that you, Peter, are founded on me. Of course, the church could never be founded on a person. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about going to Rome and seeing the tomb of St. Peter. I think it's a wonderful thing. Of course, with the COVID-19, all of us are stuck here. We can't go anywhere, but God willing, this too shall pass, and we will have the opportunity to go see these things. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because we don't have time for me to read this incredible sermon maybe we do, by St. John Chrysostom. Let's give it a shot. Okay, we have 18 minutes or so. This is the statement. This is the sermon of St. John Chrysostom on St. Peter after Peter gets up to give the first sermon on the day of Pentecost, and this is his homily on Acts, and this was one of the most incredible things I read. So he talks about Peter's boldness after the resurrection, in spite of the fact that he was, crumbled to pieces after the questioning of the slave girl who opened the gate to let him in when Jesus had been arrested. So he lifted up his voice and spoke with such boldness. And then he talks about the incredible boldness and faith of the apostles. And here's what he says. "Did they, the apostles, not fight against poverty and hunger, ignominy and infamy, for they were considered deceivers? Did they not fight against ridicule and wrath and mockery? For in their case the contraries were met. Some people laughed at them, and others punished them. Were they not made a mark for the wrathful passions and the merriment of whole cities? In other words, they were put on display, they were tortured for the amusement of people. Exposed to faction and conspiracies, to fire, the sword, and wild beasts. With bare body they took to the field against all the armed, though against them all men had arbitrary power, the terrors of rulers, force of arms in cities and strong walls, without experience of the tongue and of the condition of ordinary men, matched against the juggling conjurers, against impostors, against the whole throng of sophists and rhetoricians and of philosophers grown mouldy in the academy. And the man whose occupation had been about lakes, Peter, so mastered them, as if it cost him not so much as a dew. It was not even a contest with dumb fishes. For just as if the opponents he had to outwit were indeed more mute than fish, so easily did he get his better of them. And Plato, that talked a deal of nonsense in his day, is silent now. Well, this man, Peter, utters his voice everywhere, and not among his countrymen alone, but also among the Parthians and the Medes and the Elamites, and in India, and in every part of the earth, to all extremities of the world. Where now is Greece with her big pretensions? Where the name of Athens? Where the ravings of the philosophers? He is of Galilee, of Bethsaida. I think he meant Capernaum. He, the uncouth rustic, has overcome them all. Are you not ashamed? Confess it at the very name of the country of him who has defeated you. But if you hear his name too, and learn that he was called Cephas Petros, much more will you hide your faces. This has been done, and you undone, because you esteem this a reproach, and account glibness of tongue a praise, and want of smooth talk a disgrace. Why then is it asked, did Christ not exercise his influence on Plato and Pythagoras? Because the mind of Peter was much more philosophical than their minds. Now remember, when Chrysostom is preaching this, philosophy is still the most important thing. It's all the rage throughout the empire. Everybody aspires to be a philosopher. It was the greatest thing that you could aspire to become in the worldly sense. So that was like saying science and, becoming a whiz at technology. That was the equivalent of what philosophy was for them. So he's saying, why didn't Christ illuminate Plato? And he says, because Peter was more philosophical. What does he mean that? Remember, the word philosophy means love of wisdom. And Chrysostom and the fathers often spoke about Christianity as the true philosophy, because if you wish to be wise, you will believe in Christ. If you seek wisdom, you will seek Christ. This man was a philosopher, one apt to receive grace. If you laugh at these words, it is no wonder, for those back at that time laughed and said that these men were full of new wine, the people who received the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. But afterwards, when they suffered all those bitter calamities, exceeding all others in misery, when they saw their city falling in ruins and the fire blazing and the walls hurled to the ground, frantic horrors which no one can express, they did not laugh then. Here Chrysostom is saying that the Jews on the day of Pentecost were laughing at the apostles because they were speaking in the different languages. They had received the Holy Spirit. And people were laughing and said, oh, they're just drunk. They're full of new wine. But he said their Jews are not laughing now because after that, Jerusalem was destroyed. That's what he was alluding to here. Perhaps you do not credit the thing I am telling you. Okay? Well, if you laugh then, if you have the mind to laugh when hell is close at hand and the fire is kindled at your souls, but why do I speak about the future? Shall I show you what Peter is and what Plato is, the philosopher? let's examine their respective habits to see the pursuits of each. So now Chrysostom is going to compare Plato to St. Peter. The one, Plato, wasted his time about a set of idle and useless dogmas, and philosophical, as he says, that we may learn that the soul of our philosopher becomes a fly. Most truly said, a fly. Not indeed changed to one, but a fly must have entered the possession of the soul which dwelt in Plato. And for what? But a fly is worthy of such ideas. So he actually agrees with him, because he says Plato's ideas were worthy of a fly. The man was full of irony, of jealous feelings against everyone else, as if he made it his ambition to introduce nothing useful, either out of his own head or others. Thus he produced the Republic, Plato's Republic, we've all heard about it, right? In which he enacted those laws full of gross turpitude, lots of sins. Let the woman, he says, let the women be in common. Let the virgins go naked, and let them wrestle before the eyes of their lovers. Let there be common fathers, and let the children begotten be common. But this is not with us. Not nature makes common fathers, but the philosophy of Peter does that. As for that other, Plato's philosophy, it did away with all paternity. For Plato's system only tended to make the real father unknown, while the false one was introduced. It plunged the soul into a kind of intoxication and filthy wallowing. Let all, he says, have intercourse with the women without fear. The reason why I do not examine the maxims of poets is that I may not be charged with ripping up fables. And yet, I am speaking of fables much more ridiculous than this. Where have the poets devised something so portentous as this? And what do you say to these when Plato equips the females with arms and helmets and says that the human race has no occasion to differ from the dogs? Since dogs, he says, the male and female do the same things in common, so the women should do the same works as the men, and all be turned upside down. For the devil has always endeavored by their means to show that our race, the human race, is no more honorable than that of animals. And in fact, some have gone to such a pitch of absurdity, he means Greek philosophers, as to affirm that irrational creatures are endued with reason. And see how many ways he has run riot in the minds of those men. He's saying that the philosophers had ideas that came from the devil, okay? Whereas their leading men, the philosophers, affirm that our soul passes into flies and dogs and other brute creatures. Those who came after them, being ashamed of this, fell into another kind of turpitude and invested the brute creatures with all rational science and made out the creatures which were created on our account in all respects to be more honorable than us. They even attribute to them foreknowledge and piety. The crow, they say, knows God, and the raven likewise, and they produce gifts of prophecy and foretell the future, that there is justice among the animals, and polity and laws. So as he continues, you can see where Chrysostom is going with this. He's bringing out, of course, he studied all of this because he received a classical Greek education. He's bringing out all of the faults of these philosophers. Obviously, they wrote some wonderful things, but he's trying to show them how different, why we should not be ashamed of the saints, of somebody like Peter who was supposed to be uneducated. And by the way, the Greek pagans, there were still many pagans at the time that Chrysostom was preaching. So when he's preaching, I think Acts of the Apostles, comes from Acts. He was already Bishop of Constantinople at that time. But there were many, many pagans in the empire. The empire was not still even majority Christian at this time. And the pagans made fun of Christian doctrines, of the saints and of the scriptures, and said that Plato and the Greek philosophers, their writing, which was so sophisticated, was far superior to that of the far superior to that than this of the Scriptures. So he continues, perhaps you do not credit the things I am telling you, and perhaps you do not. If a man were fed with this fare, he would never believe that there exists a human being who finds pleasure in eating dung. The dog among them is jealous, according to Plato, but when we tell them that these things are fables and full of absurdity, they tell us that you do not enter into the higher meaning. No, Chrysostom says, we do not enter into this your surpassing nonsense, and may we never do so. For it requires an excessively profound mind to inform me what all this impiety and confusion would be at. Are you talking, senseless men, in the language of crows or of children? But Peter never thought of saying any of these things. He uttered a voice like a great light shining in the dark, a voice which scattered the mist and darkness of the whole world. Again, his deportment, how gentle it was, how considerate, how far above all vainglory. But if it had come to be in the power of any of those senseless people, because Peter had even raised the dead, and yet he looked to heaven without any self-elation, if it had come to be in the power of any of those senseless people, he means the philosophers, to do anything like that, would he not straightway have looked for an altar and a temple to be erected for him, and wanted to be equal with the gods? And what, I pray you, is that Minerva of theirs, and Apollo and Juno? There are different demons among them. There is a king of theirs who thinks it's fit to die for the mere purpose of being accounted equal with the gods. So when the Roman emperor died, they would proclaim him a god and literally build a temple to him as a god. So here we have the apostles, and Chrysostom here is giving St. Peter as an example, who literally raised people from the dead. And Peter doesn't say, look how great I am, you should erect a temple to me. Instead, the apostles always attributed everything to Christ. And they would say, don't worship us. We're just mere mortals. We're mere human beings like yourselves. When people would try to worship Paul or Barnabas or Peter, they would say, worship God. So this is what Chrysostom is bringing out here. So if a philosopher did the things that Peter did, they would expect to be worshipped as a god. But not so the men here in the church. No, just the contrary. Do you hear how they speak? The apostles. On the occasion of the lame man's cure, you men of Israel, why are you looking at us? As though by our own power or holiness we had made him walk. We are men of like passions with you. But with those emperors and philosophers, great is the self-elation, great the bragging, all for the sake of men's honors, nothing for the pure love of truth and virtue. You see, philosophers, Greek philosophy emphasizes the pursuit of virtue. It does. But it also can lead to pride. So here's Chrysostom. For when an action is done for glory, all is worthless. For though a man possesses all, if he does not have mastery over the lust of glory, he forfeits all claim to true philosophy. He is in bondage to the more tyrannical and shameful passion. Contempt of glory. This is what is sufficient to teach all that is good, to banish from the soul every pernicious passion. I exhort you, therefore, to use the most strenuous endeavors to pluck out this passion by the very roots. For by no other means can you have good esteem with God, to draw down upon yourself the benevolent regard of the eye that never sleeps. That is some sermon by St. John Chrysostom. And I'll bet he got a lot of applause for that. A lot of applause. They used to applaud in the church. And Chrysostom is the one who stopped that. He didn't like the applause. I'm sure he loved to know that the people were responding enthusiastically, but he also didn't want them to treat church as though it were entertainment, or that his oratorical skills were for the purpose of their entertainment rather than the purpose of their conversion, for the purpose of their improvement, for their spiritual improvement. So when he realized that people were treating church as a place to come to be entertained by the sermon, he began to forbid clapping in churches. And that's why we don't clap in church. It really comes from St. John Chrysostom. But I think he probably got a lot of applause for that extraordinary sermon comparing Peter to Plato. So we've come to the end of the time for today. I never did talk to you about going to Rome to see the bones of St. Peter. I'd like to encourage you to do that, but we're out of time for today. So next week, I think we will probably discuss 2 Peter. There's there's some things to discuss with 2 Peter, and a rather important passage that you've all probably heard about, and we will do that next week. So for now, let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people, Israel. Good night.